Carlo Gambino arrived in New York with nothing but a cold stare and a mind built for survival, and within decades he would rise from an invisible dock worker to the most feared and untouchable mob boss in America, leaving behind a trail of vanished rivals, unanswered murders, and a mystery that still haunts law enforcement today.
In 1921, the harbor of New York was thick with the smell of salt and coal smoke. Ships groaned as they docked, carrying thousands of immigrants whose faces were a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Among them was a slender young man from Palermo, Sicily, named Carlo Gambino. He carried no suitcase, no family, and no expression that revealed his thoughts. His dark eyes scanned the city skyline with the stillness of someone who measured every detail before making a move. Carlo's early days in America were nothing like the stories told in the villages of Sicily. The streets were not paved with gold, they were choked with noise, crime, and desperation. He found work where he could, mostly in the hidden corners of the city where the law's shadow never reached. In the back room of a small bakery in Brooklyn, he stacked sacks of flour during the day, but at night the ovens baked something far more profitable: illegal liquor shipments disguised in bread crates. The bakery was a front for the D'Antonio family, a well-established crime syndicate that controlled parts of the Brooklyn waterfront. Its leader, Salvatore D'Antonio, was a man who rarely left his lavish home, preferring to operate through layers of trusted men. He had little interest in strangers, but strangers who could keep secrets and keep their mouths shut had a way of catching his attention. Carlo was one of them. It wasn't long before he was quietly moved from bakery work to the more lucrative and dangerous business on the docks. His role was simple: oversee the unloading of cargo ships and ensure the right crates disappeared into unmarked trucks. But simplicity was a mask. The work demanded a sharp mind, a steady hand, and the ability to remain invisible in plain sight. The docks in the 1920s were a world unto themselves. Foggy mornings, the constant clang of chains, and the smell of oil on the water. Men with weathered faces and calloused hands worked side by side with men who carried pistols under their coats. Deals were made in whispers, threats in half smiles. The police patrolled occasionally, but their presence was little more than a formality. Most of them were already on someone's payroll. Carlo excelled in this environment. He never boasted about his successes, never made enemies unnecessarily, and always made sure everyone from the dock workers to the truck drivers received their share. It was not kindness but calculation. The more people who owed him a quiet favor, the harder it would be for anyone to move against him. As prohibition tightened its grip on the country, the demand for illegal liquor exploded. Speakeasies popped up in every corner of the city, and the D'Antonio family's shipments became the lifeblood of the underground nightlife. Carlo was put in charge of coordinating these operations, ensuring that cargo from Canada, the Caribbean, and even Europe made its way into New York without incident. But success in this business never went unnoticed. The Rossi Syndicate, a rival group operating out of another section of Brooklyn, began watching the docks with growing interest. Their leader, Vittorio Rossi, was known for his violent temper and willingness to spill blood for even the smallest insult. At first, the encounters between the two factions were nothing more than tense glances and the occasional missing crate, but whispers began to spread that Rossi had his eyes set on taking over the D'Antonio territory entirely. Carlo, still in his 20s, understood the danger. He also understood that in the world he had entered, survival depended on more than strength. It required patience, strategy, and the ability to strike only when the time was right. He began quietly mapping out the movements of Rossi's men, memorizing faces, routes, and weaknesses. The city was loud, but in the spaces between that noise, between the jazz clubs, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, and the hum of the elevated trains, Carlo Gambino was building something. Not just a position in the D'Antonio family, but a foundation for a power that would one day make him untouchable. What he didn't know was that the first real test of that power was closer than he imagined, and when it came, it would draw blood. The first strike came on a bitterly cold night in January. Snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes over the Brooklyn waterfront, muffling the sounds of the city. A shipment from Canada had just arrived, barrels of whiskey hidden beneath crates of machinery. Carlo Gambino stood on the pier, collar pulled up against the wind, watching the cargo being moved to the waiting trucks. Everything was running smoothly until a sudden burst of shouting shattered the night. Men emerged from the darkness, their faces wrapped in scarves, their pistols drawn. It was a raid, fast and ruthless. The Rossi syndicate had made its move. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the D'Antonio men were lying motionless on the snow, their blood spreading into dark stains. The remaining crew scattered, forced to abandon the shipment as the Rossi men took control of the pier. By the time the police arrived, the attackers were gone, and so was tens of thousands of dollars worth of whiskey. The loss hit hard. Salvatore D'Antonio was furious, demanding retaliation, but his idea of retaliation was immediate violence. A shootout in the streets, a show of strength that would send a message. Carlo saw the danger in that. Street violence was loud, messy, and invited the attention of the law. He argued for a different approach, though he did it quietly, in private. Revenge, he knew, would be far more effective if it was invisible until the moment it landed. Over the next few weeks, Carlo worked in silence. He began collecting information: who Rossi's men were, where they went, who they trusted. He paid dock workers, bartenders, and even a few corrupt policemen for details. Slowly, a map of the Rossi syndicate's operations began to take shape in his mind. He knew which warehouse stored their shipments, which speakeasies sold their liquor, and which men were careless enough to walk alone at night. One by one, those weak links began to disappear. A trusted driver was arrested during a routine traffic stop, his truck found full of stolen liquor. A warehouse mysteriously caught fire in the middle of the night, reducing thousands of dollars in inventory to ash. Another man, a bookkeeper for the Rossis, was found floating in the river, his ledger missing. No one could prove who was behind it, but the effect was immediate. The Rossi syndicate's grip on the waterfront began to weaken. Vittorio Rossi realized too late that the damage wasn't random. Someone was dismantling his operations piece by piece, and all signs pointed to the quiet young man who rarely spoke but always seemed to know more than he should. Rossi decided to strike back before he lost everything. One evening, as Carlo left a meeting with dock foremen, a car pulled alongside him, the window rolled down, and the glint of a pistol caught the light from the street lamp. But the shot never came. Before Rossi's gunmen could pull the trigger, another car slid into view, blocking their path. The attackers recognized the driver instantly, Enzo Ballanti, one of the D'Antonio family's most feared enforcers. The gunmen hesitated for just a moment, but that was enough. Enzo's men acted quickly, and the Rossi car sped away, empty-handed. The failed hit sealed Vittorio Rossi's fate. Within a week he was found in an alley, a single bullet to the back of his head. The newspapers reported it as another gangland killing, but no one dared say Carlo Gambino's name aloud. On the waterfront, the message was clear: the docks belonged to the D'Antonio family, and anyone who tried to take them would end up the same way. By the end of winter, the Rossis were finished. Their remaining men either fled the city or swore loyalty to the D'Antonio family. Carlo's role in the victory did not go unnoticed. Salvatore D'Antonio, a man who trusted few, now considered him indispensable. But power in the underworld was never a gift, it was a responsibility, and the higher Carlo climbed, the more dangerous the game became. By the early 1940s, the D'Antonio family was at the height of its power. The docks, warehouses, and shipping lanes were under their control, and the steady flow of liquor, gambling revenue, and protection money kept the organization rich. But wealth and dominance came with a cost: paranoia. Salvatore D'Antonio had built his empire on trust, but the years had worn that trust thin. He began to suspect a betrayal in every shadow. Carlo Gambino had by then risen to the position of Salvatore's most trusted lieutenant. His ability to solve problems without noise had made him invaluable. Yet that very skill also made him dangerous in the eyes of a man who feared being replaced. Salvatore started making subtle moves, reassigning men who were loyal to Carlo, keeping him away from certain high-level meetings, and quietly spreading doubt about him to other senior figures in the family. Carlo noticed the shift immediately. He had spent his life reading people, and Salvatore's actions spoke louder than any words. In the underworld, suspicion was often the first step toward a death sentence. Carlo knew that if he waited too long, he might be the one disappearing into the night.
Rather than confront Salvatore directly, Carlo began preparing for a different kind of fight, one that would leave no bullets in the streets and no witnesses to talk. He started reaching out to trusted contacts beyond the D'Antonio family, men with power and resources who had no loyalty to Salvatore. Among them was Frank Marino, a calculating figure within the Luciani crime network. The Lucianis controlled a vast gambling empire stretching from New York to New Jersey, and Marino was known for his ability to broker alliances that others thought impossible. Another key figure was Enzo Belanti, a hitman with a reputation for making people disappear without a trace. Enzo had worked for both the D'Antonios and the Lucianis at different points in his career, and his loyalty was dictated by opportunity rather than blood. Carlo offered him something more valuable than cash: permanent security and a place in a new order. Over several months, a plan took shape. There would be no open war, no police investigations, and no questions from other families. Salvatore would simply vanish. The exact details of what happened that summer night in 1943 remain a mystery, but those close to the family whispered about a meeting that Salvatore attended and never returned from. Some claimed he was taken out to sea and dropped overboard. Others believed he was buried deep beneath a construction site in Queens. Whatever the truth, his body was never found. The very next morning, Carlo stepped into the role of boss without resistance. The transition was seamless, almost as if it had been anticipated by everyone involved. The Luciani network recognized him immediately, ensuring that rival families wouldn't challenge his leadership. To the outside world, it appeared as though Salvatore had simply retired or disappeared to avoid heat from law enforcement. Within the family, the message was clear: Carlo Gambino was now in charge, and he had done it without spilling unnecessary blood. Under his leadership, the D'Antonio family changed. Violence was kept to a minimum, business was streamlined, and profits grew. Carlo avoided the flamboyant lifestyle that brought down other bosses. He rarely appeared in public, and when he did, it was in the company of respected businessmen, not armed guards. Police surveillance often turned up nothing more than quiet dinners and unremarkable meetings. Behind that calm exterior, however, every decision was deliberate. Carlo removed potential threats quietly, promoted loyal men strategically, and expanded operations into new territories while keeping law enforcement distracted elsewhere. He understood that power was best maintained by never letting anyone see its full extent. By the mid-1940s, Carlo Gambino had become the kind of leader other crime figures envied: unshakable, untouchable, and above all invisible. But invisibility was only effective as long as there were no traitors in the shadows, and in the world he ruled, betrayal was inevitable. For more than 3 decades, Carlo Gambino managed what few mob bosses in America could. He stayed free. Others rose and fell in bursts of violence and scandal, but Carlo's name rarely appeared in the papers, and when it did, it was buried deep inside, accompanied by vague accusations that never stuck. Federal agents grew increasingly frustrated. They called him the Ghost, a man who could be in the center of a criminal empire, yet leave no fingerprints, no recordings, and no witnesses willing to speak. Carlo's methods were simple but disciplined. He avoided the public spectacle of power. No flashy cars, no extravagant mansions, no careless displays of wealth that could draw attention. Meetings were held in private homes, not crowded restaurants. Messages were delivered face to face, never over the phone. When other bosses courted the press, Carlo faded into the background, letting others soak up the spotlight and the heat that came with it. Still, the longer a man held power, the more enemies he collected. By 1975, one of those enemies was someone who had once been one of his strongest allies: Frank Marino. For years, Marino had been instrumental in building connections between the D'Antonio family, now firmly under Carlo's control, and the Luciani crime network. He had profited immensely under Carlo's reign, but greed has a way of eroding loyalty. Federal investigators, desperate for a break in their long and fruitless pursuit of Carlo, approached Marino with an offer: protection, reduced charges, and a new life in exchange for information. Marino agreed. Quietly at first, he began feeding agents details about the family's gambling operations, shipment routes, and the identities of men who handled the money. His betrayal was careful, but not careful enough. Carlo had built his life on reading people, and soon he noticed the subtle signs, the questions Marino shouldn't have been asking, the unexplained absences, the small but telling inconsistencies in his stories. Once Carlo was certain, the decision was immediate. Betrayal could not be tolerated, no matter who committed it. In the spring of 1975, Frank Marino's body was discovered in the trunk of a car parked on a quiet Queens street. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and no leads. To the FBI, it was a grim confirmation of what they already knew. Carlo Gambino was still in full control, and even informants weren't safe. But Marino's death brought a kind of attention Carlo had always avoided. Federal pressure intensified. Surveillance teams trailed his associates, phone taps were installed, and undercover agents moved into neighborhoods where his men operated. Every move became riskier, every meeting a potential trap. For the first time in years, Carlo felt the walls closing in. In October 1976, news broke that Carlo Gambino had died quietly in his Long Island home at the age of 7. The official cause was natural, a heart attack in the night. There was no public funeral, only a small private gathering attended by close family. His death marked the end of an era in New York's underworld. Yet for many the story did not ring true. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the man buried under Carlo's name wasn't him at all, but a stand-in, allowing the real Gambino to vanish with a fortune hidden overseas. Others whispered that he had fled to Sicily, living under an assumed identity in a coastal village, far from the reach of American law. There were even those who swore they had seen him years later, sitting in the back of a cafe in southern Italy, older but unmistakably the same man. No one ever proved the truth. The FBI closed its files without ever charging him with a single major crime. To this day, his wealth and the full extent of his empire remain unaccounted for. Whether he truly died in that quiet bedroom or walked away into the shadows he had mastered his whole life, Carlo Gambino left behind a legacy that still unsettles those who study the history of organized crime. His name remains a reminder that the most dangerous men are not always the loudest. They are the ones you never see coming.